space Nazis. So what would Star Wars look like in a world that never had Nazis? That style has become a cultural shorthand for big bad evil that all of us recognize, even people that couldn't tell you when or where World War II was fought. They exist. Know this. Anybody can attack their neighbors, but not anybody can do it with dashing Hugo Boss threads, roll across France like they own the place, and then when they get to the coast, kick the British Empire back across the channel in fishing boats like chumps. There's an attraction to the style and mystique that has nothing to do with ideology. They have the distinctive look with the uniforms and the flags and a whole occult system of runes and skulls and grand rituals. This idea of a powerful, technologically advanced military coupled with a sort of dark mysticism is echoed in Star Wars very strongly by the Empire and its Sith rulers. I would argue that it is a direct thread. Fighting the Nazis has left a deep cultural echo in the Western world. It's of course layered on top of a lot of the older bad guy templates, which I suspect is why Americans like to cast British actors to play their villains. And of course, it's not just Star Wars. There are several examples of this in particularly the science fiction of the 70s and 80s, whether we're looking at Battlestar Galactica with the Eastern Alliance, or V, as we talked about earlier. Even Cobra in the old G.I. Joe cartoons is kind of a distilled fascist essence. That sounded like a pompous humanities grad student. Star Wars is not only the most culturally significant, it's had a half century to evolve and build on not only its own mythos, but on its historical source material. As an aside, there may be a connection between the sunburst emblem of Ming's empire in Flash Gordon and the sigil of the Galactic Empire, which can be seen as a stylized sunburst. Related here because the swastika has also historically been a representation of the sun. It's worth noting that even when Star Wars is showing us tyranny and evil, there's always some layer of optimism underneath. As though there's some latent spirit of liberty that's eroding the foundations of militant authoritarianism. Under the riding boots and jodhpurs, we see a society that looks surprisingly free. With the exception of the TSA at the Corellia spaceport, Star Wars doesn't show us a need for things like spacecraft registration or passports for galactic travel, and people openly carry blasters all over the place without any consequences, either legal or social. In many ways, what we see of Imperial society makes it look positively libertarian in compared to our own modern societies. And there's a possibility of redemption. The newer Star Wars films really start to play with this idea of random Imperials as redeemable human beings. Rogue One did it very well with the pilot. Rise of Skywalker did it less well with Hux. Most notably, Darth Vader has been gradually transformed from this faceless evil into a tragic figure, a broken man who is trapped inside of a life-sustaining cocoon, a prisoner of his own choices. And going back to our historical comparisons, just as Vader has to spend most of his time limbless in a Bacta tank, figures like Hitler had terrible digestive issues, heart trouble. Mao Zedong is another example, who had rotten teeth and frequent constipation and absolutely disgusting personal hygiene habits. I mean, seriously, Mao was like an evil version of a trash heap from Fraggle Rock. All these examples are broken people projecting power through others and causing immense suffering in the process. We're certainly not going to see the smiling force ghosts of Hitler and Mao turn back to the light, but humanizing the monsters is necessary. The cultural perception of history is still shaped by wartime needs and propaganda, and it's now compounded for several generations to the point where those narratives are really what most people know about the period. And just like the Star Wars franchise builds on itself and shifts over time, history is also an iterative process that is shaped as much by the last batch of historians as it is by the actual events. In both cases, it doesn't necessarily get better with time. New canon doesn't always jive with the source material. There is going to come a time after another immense struggle with some titanic, monstrous new enemy that our bad guy template is going to be reset. and Nazis will be shuffled off into the bin of history with redcoats and Confederates, no longer relevant enough to be used as templates for our popular cultural bad guys. Star Wars is a prime example of that mythologizing process that serves an important function of not letting us completely forget that horrendously evil acts were committed on an industrial scale. Using the echo of past enemies in entertainment can help a culture avoid making those same mistakes. It's a big part of why jackbooted, armband-wearing fascists are forever relegated to the fringe of American society. Our popular culture inoculates us against that particular authoritarianism because we instantly recognize them as the bad guys. The downside is that it can also block perception of other forms of tyranny. It doesn't have to be peaked caps and swastika brassards. Ideologues can cause just as much damage wearing pantsuits or designer ties. Like so many stories in our culture, Star Wars tells us how fragile a free society is and how easily institutions can be subverted by people with malicious intentions. All the pop culture knockoff Nazis really do protect our political system from actual old-style fascists. But it can also not only lead to what we see lately, where everyone calls their political opponents Nazis while having lost any real historical understanding, but also we can mythologize history to such an extent that we disconnect it from the regular people that were part of it. People making decisions that were rational within their experience and their objectives, because it's not peculiar to that time and place. It could be any of us. That's the real horror of it. And that's why we should always question authority and think about the implications of what we're doing and what we're being asked to do. Because the truth is, it happens all the time. It's just that Nazis had better production value than the countless other murder paloozas that are going on.